And here is one of my heroes, Dr. Barbara Rolls from Penn State University, another brilliant researcher. She has contributed so much to the field of calorie density. One of the things she knew is that our stomach contained what's called stretch receptors. When our stomachs are full, these stretch receptors get activated and they signal the brain that we are full. She discovered that all human beings eat roughly the same amount of food per day to feel full and satisfied. And that is usually about 3 to 5 pounds of food a day. If we don't eat that amount of food, that volume of food, our body can think it's starving, and that'll make us so hungry that we'll grab anything we can get our hands on, and the more calories, the better. This is why portion control really doesn't work in the long run. So all those binges and cravings, they're often just a consequence of not eating enough, particularly not enough starch. I mean, how crazy is that? Starch is to the hunger drive what oxygen is to breathing. No starch, no satiety. So how do we go from empty to full without consuming too many calories? Well, we know that we have stretch receptors, and we know that we need to eat about 3 to 5 pounds of food a day to avoid binging. Dr. Rolls and her team started to ask a profound question. How can we do this without consuming too many calories? So they weren't looking at the total number of calories. They were interested in the number of calories for those 3 to 5 pounds of food. And this is where the concept of caloric density comes into play. Now, this simply means calories per pound of food. Now, caloric density doesn't mean memorizing how many calories in a cup of blueberries or a half a cup of rice. It simply means knowing and understanding the average calorie density of a few common food groups. Calorie density simply measures the amount of calories in a pound of food. But here's the magic number, 567 calories per pound. If you eat food that on average has no more than 567 calories per pound, you can lose weight and still eat until you're comfortably full each and every time. Now, food varies in caloric density from 100 calories a pound, which is non-starchy vegetables, to 4,000 calories a pound, which is processed and refined oil. So a lot of people would come to the conclusion, well, I'll just eat salad because they'll fill me up with minimal calories. You know, oil is 40 times as calorically dense. But if you're like me or like most people, you can't survive on vegetables alone. They're just too low in caloric density. They're pretty much just water and fiber and nutrients. You'll be hungry almost as soon as you finish them. But they're really important because vegetables, especially those dark green leafies, they contain something called thylakoids, which literally have been proven to turn off the hunger switch and fight cravings for unhealthy foods. That's why they're so important to include along with the satiating starches. So for Barbara Rolls' finding to work for you, meaning that you can still lose weight while eating until you're full every time, you need to create dishes that are on average 567 calories per pound or less, and that will keep you nice and full and satiated for a very long time. Now, does that make sense, guys? You know, that's really the secret when it comes to food. You know, of course, there's other factors such as avoiding the addictive substance that override our satiety mechanisms, which we'll get into soon. But from a broad perspective, that really is the secret. Starches to the rescue. They're not to be feared. They're to be embraced. Salads, veggies, and fruits are very healthy, and we want to eat as many of them as possible. As a matter of fact, every time we eat, even breakfast, half our plate should be fruits and vegetables. But starches are the key to satiety and sustained and permanent weight loss. Remember, we're talking about whole starches like potatoes, sweet potatoes, winter squashes, whole grains, and legumes, not pretzels and cereal and bread and things like that, sugar and flour or alcohol. You know, complex carbs are like an hourglass, and they release energy slowly over time. You know, there is a huge difference between simple carbohydrates like sugar and flour and alcohol and complex unrefined carbohydrates like potatoes, whole grains, and legumes. Complex carbs have fiber, and fiber holds onto these carbohydrates, and they work like an hourglass. They release their energy slowly over time. So this is great because your blood sugar doesn't spike. You don't get cravings or mid-afternoon slumps like you do when you're having sugar and flour. And fiber keeps you full longer with no calories. It's not only important to every bodily process, but it tricks the brain into feeling that it's full. It helps flush out toxins and waste material. It binds to cholesterol. But on top of that, insoluble fiber doesn't get digested, so you stay full for longer with zero additional calories. You know, there's countless studies to back this up. There's an EPIC study with over 500,000 participants that showed that the more complex carbs people ate, the less obesity, diabetes that people had. So when you hear that carbs are bad for you, they're talking about simple carbs like flour and bread and pizza. They're not talking about whole unrefined starches. What they forgot to tell you is that complex carbs release their energy slowly over time and keep you full longer. You see, we have been lied to. People say carbs are bad. Carbs turn to sugar. Well, yeah, they are bad when they come from sugar and flour, which go through the same refining process as drugs and alcohol or alcohol. Yeah, those carbs, simple carbs, processed carbs, yeah, they are bad because they do turn to sugar once we digest them. I believed for a long time that all carbs were bad. But when I learned the truth about nutrition and the science from my mentors, Dr. Doug Lisle, Dr. Alan Goldhammer, and Dr. John McDougall, to name a few, I found out there's a huge difference between unrefined, complex carbohydrates like squashes, fruits, vegetables, potatoes, rice, and beans, and sugar, flour, and alcohol. Now let me show you something. This side may be a little technical, but please give me a minute because you'll get that the key to quitting sugar without having to give up your sweet tooth lies here. These are blood sugar levels for 3 different scenarios. The red line is for sugary foods, which is this huge spike in blood sugar, which then drops only 30 to 60 minutes later. The yellow line is for foods from refined carbohydrates like white flour. You'll see a spike and then another drop 1 to 2 hours later. Now, in both these scenarios, you're going to gain weight and have cravings, endless cravings. The weight gain happens because all the energy from the sugar is absorbed so quickly that the body doesn't know what to do with it, and it stores it as fat. And guess what your body does when your blood sugar level crashes? That's right, you want more sugar, and you get more cravings. It's a vicious cycle. It never ends. Now let's look at the blue line. This is what happens when you eat whole, unprocessed grains, fruits, vegetables, legumes. You can see how the energy is released slowly over hours, not minutes. That slow release, that means your body can utilize the energy on the spot instead of storing it as fat. Not only does the slow release mean you don't convert these complex carbohydrates into fat, that's called de novo lipogenesis. Human beings can't readily do that. Pigs can. You can also see that your blood sugar stays inside the normal range until your next meal 3 to 4 hours later. That means no cravings, no binges, no crashes, and no afternoon slumps, and no afternoon slurpees. You want to write this down. Fruits in their natural form are 100% okay, and so are potatoes and sweet potatoes and whole grains, winter squashes, all vegetables, starchy and non-starchy, legumes, beans, split peas, lentils. None of these whole foods will spike your blood sugar, giving you the cravings that you normally get from refined carbohydrates, and they will not convert into fat. Besides stabilizing our blood sugar levels and giving you constant energy, what else do complex carbohydrates do that are unrefined that simple carbohydrates that are processed and refined do? Well, complex carbohydrates are high in fiber. Simple are low in fiber. Complex carbohydrates are high in nutrients. Simple carbohydrates have few to no nutrients. Complex carbohydrates can stabilize your blood sugar, whereas simple carbohydrates spike your blood sugar and then drop them. Complex carbohydrates cause you to feel full for much longer on much fewer calories, whereas simple carbohydrates are much more calorically dense and drive cravings. Complex carbohydrates stimulate your natural metabolism. Simple carbohydrates are empty calories that are easily and readily converted into fat. Now, I think that's awesome because fruits are back, baby. And once you know a few simple tricks that we'll talk about in the next few steps, you can do amazing things to satisfy your sweet cravings without the negative side effects of sugar. You're going to need starchy vegetables to feel full and satisfied. What you just learned also means that vegetables, even starchy ones like parsnips and potatoes and sweet potatoes and butternut squash and acorn squash and kabocha squash and delicata squash, these are okay. How do you feel when you eat potatoes, sweet potatoes, beans, or legumes? Don't you feel full and satisfied compared to when you eat sugar and flour or oil or processed food? It's because starch is the key to feeling full and satisfied on fewer calories. It's been vilified for far too long. A lot of people say, well, if I don't eat oil, if I don't eat fat, I won't feel full. Well, I encourage you to take a look at the work of Dr. Susanna Holt, who created what's known as the SI, or satiety index. And she discovered that the most satiating food on the planet that gives you the most satiety for the longest is none other than the humble white potato. Now, I know this doesn't sound like the most fun thing to do. I've had clients tell me, well, abstinence isn't sexy. And I said, well, either is your impotence, or actually I remember saying that. But, abstinence is really what gives you the success to have the peace of mind that you desire and the freedom around food. This is my 2,922nd day of abstinence. And let me tell you, abstinence is bliss. Alcohol, smoking, drugs, and even certain foods target the reward centers of our brains. And researchers can even see differences in how these so-called reward centers respond to alcohol in, say, heavy versus light drinkers. Now, what this means is that some of us are just more vulnerable to the addictive substances than others. And it means that our brains can be hijacked. That's essentially what the processed food industry has done. And it's no surprise if you consider that the tobacco giant Philip Morris has owned several of the major food companies over the years, including Kraft and General Foods. I don't know if you guys are old enough to remember a commercial that I used to love about Lay's potato chips. Bet you can't eat just one. Well, it's true, because you can't, and here's why. Addictive substances flood an area in our brain with dopamine, which then creates a chain reaction. And in the end, we have created a conditioned response to certain stimuli. And when you look at food, sugar, fat, and salt do the exact same thing. They fool the brain's satiety mechanisms, which cause you to exponentially overeat. And I mentioned restaurants use more sugar, fat, and salt than you ever would at home. Processed food, the same. That's really why cheat days don't work. Can you imagine telling a recovering alcoholic to have a cheat day once a week? I mean, that would be a total disaster, right? But we try to do the exact same thing with food. For most people, abstinence actually is not restriction, it's freedom. We have to be careful what we eat. And once we know which ingredients make us binge and have cravings, what ingredients or food we crave the most, then we have to stay away from them if we want true freedom. It's counterintuitive, but abstaining from these things will give you the freedom to be in control of your health, your eating, the freedom to nourish your body and not satisfy an artificially induced craving, the freedom to be strong, to be the confident person you were born to be, and to leave all the guilt and shame and frustration behind. If you don't abstain, you'll probably be right back where you started, and there's nothing you can do about it because that's just how your brain is wired. And anyone trying to tell you otherwise just doesn't know how similar certain foods are to drugs. Sugar and flour go through the same exact refining process as drugs and alcohol. And for people that are sensitive to those, they are more drug-like than food-like. So what do we stay away from? Well, I have an acronym called SOFAs. I always tell people, if you want to lose weight and get healthy, get off the sofa. Literally and figuratively: sugar, oil, flour, alcohol, and salt. This is going to vary from person to person, but working with thousands of people, I know for sure that sugar and oil and flour, alcohol, and salt seem to be the worst ingredients. You probably have your own individual trigger foods, which you may have to stay away from. In addition, for me, that was things like cinnamon rolls and Slurpees, but also nuts and nut butters. I could not moderate the use of those things. They made me exponentially overeat. And also, you might want to stay away from what I call gateway foods, foods that trick you by being quote unquote healthy or safe, when in reality, they actually lead you to consume worse foods. And for some people, this is alcohol, coffee, cocoa powder. It could even be something very healthy like an avocado, which then leads you into eating a bunch of, fried tortilla chips. Now, because the lose weight with a full plate approach is an ad libitum diet, meaning you can truly eat as much as you want,
as long as you're eating the correct foods, we don't tell you what to eat every day or when to eat it or even how much, but we do tell you the approximate yield of each recipe. The meal plans are just suggested recipes that my friends and family love, but if you don't care for them, you don't need to make them or eat them. In fact, you really don't need to make any recipes at all. You could just eat simply from the 4 food groups: fruits, vegetables, whole grains, and legumes. Now, whether you eat 2 meals a day or 3, we recommend that you start every meal with calorie dilute and nutrient-rich vegetables, either in the form of cooked vegetables, steamed or roasted, for example, or a soup or a salad, or even all 3 if you like. But remember, this is not a vegetable-based program. This is a starch-based program. So make sure that as soon as your hunger returns after you've eaten your vegetables, that you eat ample starch. And by that, we mean the unrefined complex carbohydrates like potatoes, sweet potatoes, winter squashes, whole gluten-free grains, and legumes. You need to have the majority of your calories come from starch. And instead of eating by the clock or because of other triggers like a TV commercial, we want you to learn to get in touch with true hunger and actually eat when you're hungry and stop when you're comfortably full. If you're someone who's been dieting your whole life and restricting calories or weighing and measuring your food, this might seem difficult at first. There's going to be a learning curve. So I strongly encourage you to watch a video that Dr. Lyle recorded about weighing and measuring food so that you can understand that this is exactly not what you should do if you're trying to lose weight. It may be effective in the short term, but it certainly is not sustainable. Many people like to start their day with a big raw salad, while others prefer cooked vegetables. And for the second breakfast, many people like to have oatmeal, while others enjoy eating potatoes or sweet potatoes or beans and greens. So find a few vegetable recipes that you like, batch cook some starches so that you always have them ready, and have some fruit on hand to put in your salads or for dessert. It really is that simple. So try not to overthink it and enjoy the foods that nature intended you to eat as much as you want until comfortably full. You really can learn to love healthy food that actually loves you back.